Hello and welcome to INE's CCI Service Provider version 5 lab course. Today we will learn about OSPF path selection. For some of you who do not know me, my name is Rohit Pardasani and I would be your instructor throughout this course. I'm a full-time instructor with INE and I have 5 CCIs: CCI in Route Switch, CCI Security, CCI Voice, CCI Collaboration and CCI Service Provider. So let's look at path selection. How does OSPF choose which path to put in the routing table and which path to select and take a specific path? Well, the first thing you must know is that OSPF uses cost as a metric to choose the shortest path for each destination. This is true but not entirely correct. When I receive the same prefix from two neighbors, how am I going to select which path to put in the routing table? Well, that depends on, the first thing is the prefix length. If the prefix length is same, it goes to the next criteria, is administrative distance. If that is same, it does not look at cost. That's why I say that cost is not entirely correct, because before cost, it looks at O routes or OIA routes or OE routes or ON routes or OE2 routes. It basically looks at that. If I receive an intra-area route versus an inter-area route, I would prefer intra-area route, O routes. O routes are preferred over OIA. If that is same, it then goes to metric. So OSPF will first look at the type of path to make a decision and secondly look at the metric. This is the preferred path list that OSPF uses. It basically looks at O, which is intra-area, is preferred over inter-area, which is OIA. E1 is preferred over N1 and then E2 is preferred over N2. This is the basic path selection based on the type of path. So if I receive an O route and an OIA, I would prefer O. If I receive OIA and OE1, I would prefer OIA. OE1 wins over N1. I would not look at metric. I would always look at the type of path before looking at metric. Now after path selection, it will look at the lowest cost path. To give a quick example, when prefix X is learned as an intra-area route and as an inter-area route, then OSPF will always select intra-area route even if the inter-area route has a lower cost. Since Cisco iOS release 15.1.2s, Cisco uses the path selection order from RFC 3101, which obsoletes RFC 1587. What this basically means is that it prefers N1 routes before E1 and N2 before E2. In other words, the preferred list becomes O, which is preferred over OIA, which is preferred over N1, which is preferred over E1, which is preferred over N2, which is preferred over E2. Now, if you look at this diagram here, I have already configured all the routers as per this diagram. So router 2 is completely in area 0. He's completely in area 0, all its interfaces. Router 3 has this link in area 0 and this loopback is in area 3. Router 4 has this link in area 0 and this link is basically redistributed in OSPF. And router 4, when he's redistributing this loopback, he is redistributing this loopback as E1. Router 5 also has this link in OSPF in area 0 and this loopback is redistributed in OSPF as E2. Router 6 has this link in area 167 and this loopback is redistributed as N1. So this area has been configured as NSSA. Router 7 has this link in OSPF, which is in area 167, and this loopback is redistributed as N2. So let's confirm how OSPF does path selection. Now for router 1, I have chosen iOS XRV. iOS XRV uses the old RFC, which basically means that O routes are preferred over OIA. OIA wins over OE1. OE1 wins over ON1, ON1 wins over OE2, and OE2 wins over ON2. But if I replace router 1, which is iOS XR, if I replace that with an iOS XZ, which has an iOS version higher than 15.1, in that case, the behavior would be different. It would basically be as per the new RFC, which is O is preferred over OIA, OIA is preferred over ON1, ON1 wins over OE1, then ON2 wins over OE2. So going back to the previous slide that we have, this is as per the new RFC, this list. And if I go back to this list, this is as per the old RFC. So iOS XRV is going to behave like this as per the old RFC, which is O, then OIA, then E1, then N1, then E2, and then N2. But iOS XZ is going to behave like O, OIA, N1, E1, N2, and then E2. So let's test this out. So what I'm going to do right now is I will look at XR1 and do a show route OSPF. And let's do a no shut to all my loopbacks. If you look at this diagram carefully, I have the same loopback on every router. So router 2 is sending this loopback as an O route. He's sending as O. Router 3 is going to be sending as OIA. Router 4 is sending this as OE1. Router 5 is sending this as OE2. Router 6 is sending this as ON1. And router 7 is sending this as ON2. So now how will R1 select the path? Let's go back to router 1 and check. So looking at this diagram, by default router 1 should select R2 because O routes are preferred over everything else. It doesn't matter what the cost is. So let's go back to here and let's do a no shut to all my loopbacks. And no shut here on 5, on 4, 3, and lastly 2. Now if I look back at XR1, which route should he prefer? He should definitely prefer the O route. So let's do a show route OSPF. As you can see, XR1 is preferring O over everything else. O is preferred over OIA or N1 or E1 or E2 or N2. Doesn't really matter. O is preferred over everything else. Even if my cost was higher. So let's say if I go back to router 2 and increase my cost to my loopback by saying IP OSPF cost, let's say 100. And if I go back to XR1 and do a show route OSPF, my cost is now showing as 101 total cost to reach that loopback. It doesn't really matter. Cost would not come in play because the preference as per the routing table is always based on prefix length first. If the prefix length is same, it goes to the next criteria, which is OSPF 80 administrative distance. Now everyone is sending the same prefix length 1.1.1.1/32. Everyone is sending an OSPF route, so the 80 would be the same. The next it goes to is the type of path. So O is preferred over OIA or other type paths. So it doesn't really reach the cost. So he would always prefer OSPF or O routes, intra-area routes over everything else. Now let's say if that loopback, I'm going to shut this down now. If I shut this down, what's the next preference? OIA should be preferred. So if I look back at XR1 now and do a show route OSPF, I should now see OIA route from R3. So OIA is preferred now over OE1, ON1, OE2, ON2. Everything would be preferred. It doesn't really matter again the cost because OIA wins over everything else. So even if I go back to R3 and change the cost to 100, XR1 would still choose R3 OIA route. He would still choose that because OIA wins over everybody else. So now if I go and shut down R3, What do you think XR1 is going to choose? Is he going to choose OE1, OE2, ON1 or ON2? Well, as per the old RFC, he is going to prefer OE1. So OE1 wins over everybody else because O is not there anymore and OIA is not there anymore. So OE1 should be the next winner. So if I go to R3 and shut down my loopback, and if I go back to XR1 and do a show route OSPF, this time I see OE1. So now R2 is not sending him O route, R3 is not sending him OIA route, R4 is sending him E1, R5 is sending him E2, R6 is sending him N1, R7 is sending him N2, so E1 wins. Because as per the old RFC, iOS XR uses the old RFC, so as per that, OE1 wins over ON1 and everybody else. Now what happens when R4 goes down? Let's shut down R4. If I shut down R4, what's going to be the next in the list? Does OE2 win? No, it's going to be ON1. So this time ON1, which is R6, who's sending him ON1, wins over R7 sending him ON2, which wins also above R5 sending him E2. So if I look back at XR1 now and do a show route OSPF, I now see ON1, which is from R6. So again, cost really does not really matter, even if I go and change the cost. ON1 wins over OE2 and ON2. Now what happens when R6 goes down, or that loopback goes down on R6? This time, your iOS XR is going to select R5 because R5 is sending him OE2 and R7 is sending him ON2. So it should select R5. Let's go and shut down and check. If I do a show route OSPF, I see R5 OE2. So you see it's different from iOS XZ. If it was iOS XZ, I would see ON2 here. Because in XR, it is O, OIA, then OE1, ON1, OE2, then ON2. But in iOS XZ, it's going to be O, OIA, ON1, OE1, ON2, and then OE2. So right now I have OE2. So now I have R5 sending me OE2 and R7 sending me ON2. If I shut down R5 now, I would now get the last choice, which is ON2, show route OSPF, which is ON2. So you see, this is how OSPF does path selection. Just saying that OSPF does path selection based on the cost or the metric, it's not entirely true. It is true if your prefix length, your administrative distance, and your type of path is the same. If that is the same, then yes, it chooses the lowest cost and puts that in the routing table. One thing you must remember about the cost is that OSPF does path selection based on the cost, which is based on reference bandwidth, and the default reference bandwidth is 100 meg. So OSPF does not differentiate between fast Ethernet and gig ports. So if you want gig ports or 10 gig ports to be incorporated with correct cost, you must basically go and change your reference bandwidth. I hope this video was informative to you, and thank you for viewing.